Hello, welcome to today's Law Awareness webinar on Worker in a Crisis, jointly organized by the Law Society's Pro Bono Services and the NTUC. My name is Sarita Misir, and I will be your host for this evening. Please note that the discussion and any material provided in this webinar are not intended as substitute for any form of professional legal advice. You should always consult a lawyer if you require specific legal advice. Okay, with that done, let's get right into the discussion. On our panel today, we have Mr. Patrick Tay and Mr. Francisco. Patrick is the Assistant Secretary General of NTUC and also Director of NTUC's Legal Services and Strategy. Francis is a Senior Lawyer, Legal Advisor, and Mediator at Harry Elias. Patrick and Francis, thank you both for joining us this evening.
Hi,
Thanks.
Good evening, everyone.
Glad to be here.
Okay, so Patrick, why don't we start with you? We've all seen the news reports recently with the jobless rate being the highest in 10 years, with retrenchments rising and job vacancies falling. Can you speak a little bit more about what you expect this trend to be moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Sarita. And in fact, the last couple of months, it's been difficult times. Although the first quarter labor market report just released by the Ministry of Manpower 2 weeks ago showed that unemployment rate as well as retrenchments have climbed up, but not as high as levels we've seen during SARS in 2003 and, of course, the 08-09 global financial crisis. But however, my ground sense, having interacted with many workers, different companies, doing various managing excess manpower measures on the ground, is that I don't think that a report is a true reflection of what we are experiencing. I've met many residents, workers, many of my unionists, and really, it's uncertain times. I think we see all sectors, almost all sectors affected, either more deeply or perhaps less deeply. And as you can see, we had 4 rounds of budgets, ending off with 2 weeks ago, the Fortitude budget, which looks at helping companies to cut costs, to save jobs, and more importantly, to help workers ride through and tide through this difficult time. In fact, the last couple of months, I think, looking at what's happening, particularly exacerbated by the fact that we had 2 months of downtime of a lot of trade and commercial activities with the circuit breaker period, I think I do expect to see the second quarter labor market figures as well as the rest of the year being bleaker than the first quarter. I think in the first quarter, the report, I think the full effects or the ramifications of COVID-19 pandemic has not been fully felt yet. In fact, the last 2 months, even as we are talking at this moment of time, I think a lot of companies are really looking at how to manage excess manpower. And therefore, in the last few months, there were a series of advisories, guidelines that have been fleshed out, which later we will talk more. But I mean, more importantly, many of the 4 rounds of budget and a lot of work on the ground through, for example, like NTUC and labor movement with our unionized companies. I think we are endeavoring to work closely with companies and the workers on the ground to make sure that we minimize the impact where possible. But like I said, the reality practically on the ground, what I'm seeing in the coming weeks and months will be more uncertainties, and I do sense a lot of fear and anxieties amongst our workers. In fact, just last week when I was doing sort of like a straw poll over a webinar, a lot of workers were actually quite fearful and quite anxious about what's going to be like in the jobs market in the coming months. So I think that is a true reflection of what's happening on the ground. And I foresee the next coming months, it's very important for us to work together and to later on we can share more on what we can do to overcome and to ride through this difficult period.
Thank you, Patrick. That's very dire news, but I hope that this webinar hopefully should give some help or assistance to our attendees today. Francis, let's move on to you. Francis, can you give us a quick update from a lawyer's perspective? What is the kind of employment-related questions that you're seeing right now from your clients versus pre-COVID?
Thanks, Sarita. I think the observations by Patrick are really spot on. Anecdotally, I can tell you that just last year, from October to about December, everything was still quite upbeat. I was getting inquiries about how can we get more manpower, how are we going to expand plans, to deal with increased demand. And then come January, February onwards, there's suddenly this huge about turn where uncertainty rules the day. Many companies are struggling for their existence. It didn't help that there was the circuit breaker. We understand why it was needed, but economically, that was quite devastating for many companies. And this then has the knock-on effect on the employees who are understandably worried about whether they'll still have a job. And employers are then asking, how can we deal with both the economic consequences of trying to sustain our business as well as managing the manpower that is with us? And there is this balancing act that the employers are just struggling to go through. And I'm sure it can't be easy for the employees on the ground who are experiencing this turmoil and uncertainty as well. So Patrick is right. In the coming months, we have to work together and see how we can get through this.
Thank you, Francis. I think this is a good time then, as you mentioned, I think let's move on to, talking about the different ways that employers can reduce manpower costs. So, Patrick and Francis, we've all seen, there have been a lot of advisories being released by the tripartite partners, guidelines from MOM, relating to managing excess manpower, and also to do with, salary reductions, retrenchments. I guess the three main ones so far are the tripartite advisory on managing excess manpower and responsible retrenchment, the tripartite advisory on retrenchment benefits, and the tripartite advisory on salary and leave arrangements. Patrick, can you give us, a brief explanation about why the need to release these three advisories back to back, and what is the key message really that the tripartite partners want to send out to employers and workers?
Thanks, Sarita. Yes, definitely, because I think with this COVID-19 pandemic and what's happening in the last couple of months, we are definitely in unprecedented times. That's why we had unprecedented budgets and expenditures to help boost the economy and to save jobs and save businesses. But maybe just to allude to the three important pieces of advisories and guidelines which you alluded to earlier. Actually, there's this tripartite advisory of managing excess manpower. This is not a new piece of advisory. I recall vividly because I have been in the labor movement for the past 18 years, and that was issued actually sometime end 2008, early 2009, as a response to the global financial crisis. And then this tripartite advisory on managing excess manpower was used as a guiding post for companies whenever they want to execute various managing excess manpower measures in the companies and businesses. And of course, the key rules of engagement, or the key message we wanted to send through that tripartite advisory, is retrenchment should be the last resort and final option. So there are a whole list of things that have been fleshed out, and even in that form and time and space, in the tripartite advisory, it has also evolved, and because of TAFEP and the various other lobbying efforts into fair employment practices, this tripartite advisory of managing excess manpower became the tripartite advisory for excess manpower, managing excess manpower, as well as responsible retrenchment. So in that piece of document, it also outlines how retrenchment benefits should be paid and how much, and basically as a guiding post and a proxy for companies and businesses which need to take those causes of action. However, yes, you're right. Earlier this year, of course, that piece of advisory still holds. However, there were two actually subsequent advisories which are very important, particularly serving the COVID-19 situation, because we are seeing many companies facing cash flow issues. You can see from newspaper reports, and it's also what's published online, that there are more bankruptcies and insolvencies than ever in the last couple of months. So there's a tripartite advisory on salary and leave arrangements, particularly for COVID-19 situations, as well as a tripartite advisory on the way you should pay retrenchment benefits during this COVID-19 period. So these are important pieces we should need to take reference to, not just for employers, but for workers alike. because you might think the company may not have abided to the original tripartite advisory of managing excess manpower, but however, there are these two other advisories as a supplement, because I think, but the key refrain from these three pieces of advisories is that we should try to use the various measures to manage excess manpower, such as it could be no pay leave, yeah, it could be a shorter work week, it could be time banking, and of course wage cuts, leveraging on the flexible wage system we have in Singapore, and a whole host of other measures which are articulated in the various advisories. And basically the key message is try to cut costs to save jobs, and retrenchment should be the last resort. In fact, this very line that repeats many times in the advisories.
Patrick, thank you for that. I'm curious, actually, from your perspective, then, being so close to the labor movement, what do you see amongst all these alternatives to retrenchment, that is listed in the tripartite advisory? What do you see as really the prevailing trend, or is there really, a particular preference that employers have for certain alternatives
Yes.
versus others?
Yes. What we've been observing in the last couple of months, I mean, actually thanks to the job support scheme, that has helped quite tremendously. And in fact, a lot of employers and businesses do applaud it. And of course, it's starting to taper off now that we are in phase 1, phase 2, and the reopening. And that's why we need to really look at what's happening in the latter half of this year. But I think with the job support scheme, it has allowed many companies, well, at least I can say for the unionized companies, they've been holding the line and trying to leverage on the entire plethora of schemes, support schemes in terms of cash flow especially for the SME businesses, and as well as the job support scheme. And over and above that, some have even leveraged on the training schemes. A good example would be, for example, like the aviation and aerospace sector, severely affected. In fact, travel, tourism, as well as hospitality are equally affected. So what has happened in the last couple of months, if you have noticed, we have managed to get quite a number of air crew, air crew to because I mean basically there's basically no flying time at all, and all the planes are, most of the planes, not all, some maybe for cargo or other emergency travels, otherwise are actually high and dry. So what's happening is that we have segued them to be transport ambassadors. So you might see some of these, cabin crew from our local airlines, at bus interchanges, transport hubs, and even MRT stations. And they have also served as ambassadors in some of the hospitals, for example, like Khoo Teck Puat Hospital. And in fact, tourist guides, because of the really, the curtailment of travel as well as tourism, because of the circuit breaker, a lot of tourist guides are actually left high and dry. So what's happening is that we have got some of them to become safe distance ambassadors, some new role. You see some of them out in the streets there whenever you go to the mall or supermarket, or you're on the line in the queue to do safe entry. So some of them actually, the safe distance ambassadors and all these looking at entry points, are actually some of our freelance and self-employed workers who are trying to find meaningful work and engagement during this period. And finally, of course, training. I think training, because of COVID-19 and the whole list of challenges. So in the last 4 budgets, actually, there's an enhancement of training funds, be it Skills Future Credit, be it all the various training support. So to encourage companies to send their workers for training, and even for self-employed, they can actually go for training and even get a stipend. So these are some of the ways that many of our workers and businesses are employing to stave away or to actually manage this downtime.
Thank you, Patrick. That's very good to know. Francis, moving on to you then. Can you tell us about the legal effect of these advisories? Is it mandatory for employers to follow them? And are there consequences if employers don't?
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. Now, let's take a step back and look at our Singapore labor laws. The labor laws are deliberately crafted in what I call a light touch. The aim here is so that our labor force, our employers are not shackled by cumbersome legislation, but are able to have a nimble workforce. So in a sense, it is easy to hire. It is also easy to let staff go. In Singapore, if you have a contract term that says either party are able to give each other 1 month's notice of termination, a contract can be contractually terminated in this way, no questions asked. So then the question would be, where do all these advisories fit in? We need to understand also the history of our labor movement. Out of our unique circumstances, we are a country that has adopted tripartism, okay, where all the various stakeholders have agreed there's no need for confrontational politics or unionized fighting against the employers. It is better for us to all work together and see how things can be harmonized. And these advisories fit right in there. You've got now legislation that says you can let staff go fairly easily. But we are in an unprecedented crisis situation now, where if every company just takes that approach of letting staff go, that's where you're going to have this huge spike in unemployment. And so the tripartite partners have actually come together to set what is called an industry standard of good practices, sensible practices to help parties actually work through this. And so, as you hear, retrenchment is the last resort. You've got business problems, financial cash flow issues, and you've got excess manpower. How are you going to deal with it? You've heard from Patrick earlier. How are the various methods, training, time banking, reductions in salary, and retrenchment then is the last resort. Now, what if employers don't follow? All right. These advisories serve two functions. They set an industry benchmark of what is a good practice. So if employers don't follow it, and if they are hauled either to the, ECT, the Employment Claims Tribunal, or if they are brought before the TADM, then the employer's behavior is going to be measured against these benchmarks, and it's going to be then decided more easily as to whether or not they've acted responsibly or not. At the same time, aggrieved employees who feel that maybe they've been unfairly treated, they can go to these advisories and see whether their fact scenario falls within one of those uh, uh, cases that are being discussed, and then they can make an assessment as to whether or not they should pursue a claim further. So I think really these advisories fulfill a nice educational role, and if employers don't follow them, well, there are consequences where MOM could choose to either put them on a watch list, choose to withhold employment passes, and perhaps other benefits. You don't necessarily need to, get into serious trouble with the courts or the law. There are other ways whereby, the screws can be actually put on the employers to make them fall into line. But I think the real purpose of these advisories is to help everyone understand where the benchmark and the best practices are so that good sense can prevail.
Thank you,
Maybe
Francis. Oh, sure.
I just wanted to chime in on what Francis said. I can't agree more because I remember filing a parliamentary question earlier this month and it was answered by the Minister of Manpower, Mrs. Josephine Teo. And I was asking, what if some of these unfair practices or non-compliance with some of these advisories, or what will happen next? For example, if the company really is able to pay retrenchment benefits and fail to do so, I can understand if they are in dire straits or in the brink of liquidation. But if they are doing well and are able to do so, and if it's a clear-cut case of retrenchment, I think such unfair practices or not conforming to industry standards and such advisories, she has made publicly a statement that like what Francis mentioned earlier, executive measures may be taken against them. It could be withholding work passes, but I remember her saying very vividly, including withholding job support scheme payments as well. So that's something employers need to look out for. Yes, it may not be law, but there may be other executive measures. But I thought just wanted to mention another point is that the things that you do as an employer, whether you comply by the black letter law or when you do things unfairly or you try to do things fairly, I think the key thing is to be trying to be as fair, as responsible, and where possible. I mean, it's difficult times now, but as progressive as possible. Why? Because whatever you do to to displace staff or to lay off workers or execute certain forms of actions, I think it's not just those affected staff that leave you, but it's those staff that are actually still left behind in companies that are watching very closely your very actions and decisions. So I think it's very important. So this is my message out there to a lot of companies, businesses, be it small or be it large. I think there's a lot of reputational risk involved, especially when you don't do things properly and in compliance with some of these advisories. So it's more than meets the eye, I think.
Thank you, Patrick. I want to go on to this point about, do these new advisories and, the indications for the government, does this mean that when it comes to termination with notice by employers versus retrenchment, is this a new norm that we're looking at in the market?
Yes, I think I in that same sitting, I also asked, well, it's COVID-19 time, so as a Labour MP, I was all out and it was I was like firing questions after question earlier this month during the sitting, and one of it was to ask the Tripartite Alliance for Dispute Management. Are they seeing a rise in number of cases where there's wrongful dismissal, unfair termination? So yes, the short answer is yes. You can refer to the Hansards for this, including my LinkedIn and Facebook pages. I actually shared the breakdown and data. I can't remember off my fingertips, but there is data available. And yes, there's a rise in number of these cases, and MOM has also come out in no uncertain terms that to adjudicate it judiciously and to see whether these cases are really deemed wrongful or not. Because termination of employment is definitely a tricky area, because Employment Act, as what Francis alluded to earlier, has a light touch. So when it comes to contractual termination, this is one area which where we see a lot of disputes arising, whether it's fair, unfair, or is it in compliance with your employment contract, or was it done indiscriminately? So I think that's definitely a growth area, and maybe Francis can share more about his experiences, particularly in this area, I'm sure.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Patrick. Again, let's go back to the basic position of the Singapore law. If you have a contract which has a contractual term that says either party can give 1 month's notice of termination. Now, if the employer exercises that, there's no need for the employer to give any reason whatsoever. He gives you the 1 month's notice. He can even choose to give you 1 month's pay in lieu of notice and ask you to leave on the same day. All right. And that is what the law calls contractual termination. Now, the question then comes in, when does it cross the line to become wrongful dismissal? All right. Now, if the company has exercised this contractual termination clause on you, then it becomes your responsibility, if you feel aggrieved, to actually show why there is a case to be made out for wrongful dismissal. All right. Wrongful dismissal, even on the use of these contract terms, could result if you felt that you were discriminated against, either by age, gender, or disability, or if there was some reason that had been given, and then it turns out that actually that reason was false or unjustified. All right. Or if you have been exercising what is actually your right. So, for example, you disagree with some salary benefits, and then you decide to file for a TADM, case, and then the next thing you find you are contractually terminated. All right. Now, these could be instances where there is an element of wrongful dismissal. All right. But do understand that the burden is still very much on you as an employee. If this has been exercised on you, the contractual termination, to show that the dismissal was wrongful in the first place. All right. So now a lot of people out there listening would say, my goodness, this is a terrible thing. It's a heavy burden on us. And that's where the various tripartite advisories have come in to level the playing field, to actually set out for employers guidelines, to say if this scenario occurs, then likelihood, if it's brought before the TADM, is going to be interpreted as a wrongful dismissal. So I think it's important for us to understand that these advisories set out the best practices, and parties, both employers and employees, should do their best to actually, be familiar with these. Very often, from my experience, disputes between the employer and the employee arise out of poor communication, which engenders hurt feelings. And then that's where everything spirals out of control. But I think if cooler heads abide by these practices, I think we should be able to navigate through this, even though the times are difficult, and maybe reach a soft landing.
Yeah, maybe I just want to chime in here and really say that being from the National Trades Union Congress, I can't help but say this. But if you're a union member, if you are, and if you are in a unionized company, we have actually a group of full-time industrial relations officers and practitioners to help, including our union leaders on the ground. So in most cases, the union as well as the industrial relations officers help advise, especially if you face issues in your workplace. It could be a grievance, it could be unfair dismissal, it could be any issues on the ground in the workplace, and we provide advisory to you to see, and also to discuss with you what are the causes of action, and of course to work with management, particularly the human resource or human capital department, so that we can resolve things at the lowest level. And of course, in some more acrimonious cases, we will escalate them either to the ministry or onward to the industrial arbitration court. But otherwise, there's actually this. I know many of you out there may not be aware, because during peace times, during good times, the union movement is not exactly that relevant, except probably I know many will relate the NTUC with fair price rebates and income insurance. But mind you, I've seen it before in the SARS crisis, in the global financial crisis, especially, and now in this COVID-19 pandemic. I can't emphasize more the need for us to band together, to work together, stay, because I think unity in strength, that's important, because you may be the next person. So I think very important. We want to be behind you in this journey. In fact, myself being heading up the legal department in the NTUC, we are actually a department full-time supporting all our unions across Singapore, so that whenever you face any issues or complex issues, we'll make sure we provide you with the necessary advice and help. Likewise, this partnership in LawWorks Pro Bono Services Office, and therefore we also provide legal clinics as well for those who maybe perhaps it may not be a situation where there's a unionized company, but we can help you to advise you your various causes of action and recourses.
Thank you, Patrick. I think we can go into a bit more detail in terms of the different assistance and support schemes available as we move on our discussion. But Francis, I wanted to go back to your earlier point. When you mentioned about termination of employment by notice in Singapore, basically the employer can just give you your notice, just give you a notice, either wait out the notice period or pay you salary in lieu. I wanted to go back to the point. I mean, to me, it actually looks like it's quite similar to what a retrenchment actually is, right? Where your employer gives you your retrenchment notice, and they pay you a certain sum of money, perhaps, or they just buy out your notice period. So really, what is the, but obviously, when you talk about retrenchment, there are different obligations, under the tripartite advisories that the employers would owe versus just a normal contractual termination. how then can people find out, whether their employer is just trying to be a bit funny here? They are just basically doing a disguised retrenchment perhaps, and just labeling it as a contractual termination, but actually what it is is a retrenchment when you really look at it. Is there any definition under the law or under the tripartite advisories of what retrenchment entails?
Well, I think the short answer is in the legislation, there's no definition of retrenchment. Okay, and that I think is where the tripartite advisories have actually stepped in to clarify the position, whereby there's a very simple guideline. If an employer is somehow dealing with excess manpower and you have been let go, even under a contractual termination, and there is actually no plans by this company to replace the headcount eventually, then there is a presumption that this is a retrenchment exercise. Now, why is this important? Because assuming that presumption is followed through, then it would trigger the retrenchment benefits that are encouraged under the tripartite advisories. And then the various protocols should also be observed, such as reporting, notifications, and best practices need to be adhered to. So I think at this stage, the message out there would be employers, if you are dealing with excess manpower issues, do consider really carefully, because there will be scrutiny. There will be scrutiny of your actions, and I think you will need to be prepared to justify or to explain your actions and your position if you are queried or taken to task with the authorities. So I think that messaging needs to go out there. It's not so much to be a threat, but I think as Patrick was talking about earlier, you've got to look at this crisis not just as an isolated event. You are talking about your manpower needs, your reputation for the medium to the longer term. What kind of employer do you want to be remembered as? How are you treating your staff? Are you humane? Are you treating them, in a gentle and humane manner? And I think all of these add up. Harkening back, in the good times, the tripartite advisories were actually intended to be best practice guides, and for employees, they could actually check and see how many of these, whether your company falls into one of those that adopts these standards, and you become kind of like a model employer, as it were. And I think these kind of intangibles cannot be ignored. And in the good times, it's easy to just say, we love to do this. But I think now in this crisis time, that's where our values are tested, and that's where our togetherness is tested as well.
Thank you, Francis. Patrick, I wanted to follow up with you on this point, right? Hearing from you from the labor movement, this whole thing about the MOM's clarification on the presumption of retrenchment, what has this been taken well by, from what you've heard on the ground by your different NTUC stakeholders and your unions? And also then, on a related note, are you actually seeing disputes arising because of this particular clarification, where workers come in and unions perhaps come in as well, and they say that, hey, actually this is a disguised retrenchment under the MOM's presumption?
So there's actually we see the clear dichotomy between the union member and the unionized environment, and where it is as compared to a non-unionized environment. In a unionized environment, if there's similar issues or disputes, particularly when there's possibly a case of wrongful dismissal, usually in all cases the union will speak and take up the case, and where needed, the route as provided by the Industrial Relations Act, Section 35, is to refer the case to the Ministry of Manpower, and in this case, you'll be adjudicated by the Minister for Manpower. That's for a unionized environment. However, many of you may not be union members or in non-unionized companies. So that's where we came up with the tripartite lines for dispute management and the Employment Claims Tribunal. Please bear in mind the Employment Claims Tribunal is not a tripartite mechanism like the Industrial Arbitration Court. it is by the state courts. It's the judiciary. So I think, therefore, in all aspects, I think when you bring a case up to ECT, it's going to be adjudication based on whatever evidence you can produce, whatever evidence you can show, whether verbal, written, whatsoever, in whatever form. So that's very important to note. So I have started seeing, particularly in the past few months, more people having such issues, because when employers serve notices to terminate staff, quite a number of them do come to the labour movement to seek advice, even through our legal clinics as well. And we do tell them, you need to go through TADAM firstly to find out, because TADAM provides a very economical, accessible service. Yeah, of course, ideally you get counsel and you hire a lawyer, but TADAM as well as ECT was set up to provide simple, easy, quick access to advice on whether you are able to file a claim, or whether there's in fact a case for wrongful dismissal based on existing tripartite guidelines and advisories. So yes, we're seeing an increasing number of cases. I think there's more awareness by people of the fact that TADAM now sees wrongful dismissal cases. In fact, TADAM, when it was formed, including ECT, did not see wrongful dismissal cases until 1st April last year. So after much lobbying by the labour movement and having seen more cases, they decided to amend, and allow ECT as well as TADAM to hear wrongful dismissal cases. So I think it's still early times, but my biggest worry and apprehension is particularly during this period, where sometimes employers may not know some of these fair, progressive practices to comply with, because some of them may be very small and medium enterprises. It could be a micro SME, in fact. So they may not have the luxury of a full HR human capital function to see through the implementing and the smooth communication of all this. So I think if in doubt, yeah, there are various resources available. The MOM website, NTUC website. I think do look out for those. But I just can't emphasize more that communication is crucial and vital, particularly during this COVID-19 times. Not just the last 4 months, but I think in moving ahead in the next, I would say easily 12 to 18 months at the least. I think very important, not just communicating in the normal sense of the word, but I think very regular communications, and that's what's happening in the unionized companies. Regular communication, union leaders on what's happening, the state of the business, the state of the company. I think if employers and businesses are open, transparent, and communicate frequently and regularly, particularly during this period, in fact, during the circuit breaker period, communication is actually encouraged. Why? Because everyone is working from home and there's very little physical contact and physical meetup. So I know some companies have resorted to virtual town halls, etc. I think it's good. It's a good practice to communicate with your staff and employees. Even if the company is going through doldrums and going into the red, I think it's important to be open and transparent. Why do I say that? So in the event you need to exercise some of your measures that we've illustrated earlier, then I think you'll be more amenable, and employees can swallow it better because they know what's happening to the company, they know the various difficulties and challenges the company is facing, and I think so. Therefore, in a way, being open and transparent is not a compromise, but actually it's sort of building trust between employers and their employees. So actually, it's a great time, I think, during this crisis to build trust, and it goes a long way in securing employee loyalty.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so why don't we move on then to maybe it's the more important topic, probably the most important topic for some of our attendees here, which is retrenchment benefits. Patrick, Francis, can you maybe give us an overview before I move on to Patrick? Can you give us an overview of the law on payment of retrenchment benefits? We have the tripartite advisory, that talks about payment of retrenchment benefits, but really, is there, we've also heard you explain that, they don't exactly have they're not exactly full law, although there are certain consequences if you don't follow. Is there actually any kind of proper full law that governs retrenchment benefits then?
Okay, let's go back again to this idea of contractual termination. All right. So the current state of our case law is that if there is a notice period contained in your contract, so let's, for discussion purposes, instead of 1 month, let's take 3 months notice of termination. All right. Then, as long as they gave you 3 months notice or pay in lieu of notice equivalent to that 3 months, that's all that you're contractually entitled to. And as an employer, that's all that you are contractually bound to do. All right. So, in other words, retrenchment benefits beyond your contractual notice period are not exactly legislated as a legal obligation. However, it is also recognized in these tripartite advisories that there is this human element, that people are losing jobs, they have livelihoods at stake. It will be meaningful to them to receive retrenchment benefits to help them tide over this difficult period. All right. And if the matter were to be disputed, then there will be this big debate as to how much should you be paid in terms of retrenchment benefits. What is the quantum? And we lawyers, when you get into all this number counting, you can have spreadsheets and big debates as to what is the market practice. But that's the beauty of our tripartite advisories, is cut through all that. They've made recommendations. They said your number of years of employment and how that correlates to what would be fair amounts that you should receive in terms of a retrenchment benefit. And that helps really companies and employees have a landing as to what is best practice, what is expected, what is fair. And I think if all parties play by these rules, we would be able to have a more systematic approach to this whole idea of retrenchment, what is fair to be paid, quite apart from what the law provides. This black letter law says you don't have to bother. But as we discussed earlier, there's more at stake here. And then the question is, if you want to be fair, how fair should you be? And that's where you call in aid the guidelines in the tripartite advisory. And I think you will have a clear roadmap as to what would be probably a good thing to do at this time.
Yeah.
Patrick, I want to follow on this point, right, about payment of retrenchment benefits. You mentioned earlier that, when it comes to a unionized company, if you're a member of the union, then of course there's a collective agreement, that will cover or provide for a certain sum or certain kind of calculation that people can use to
Yes.
for payment of retrenchment benefits. I have an interesting question from one of our audience members today about what about PMETs, non-unionized workers, right? Are they also eligible for retrenchment benefits? The particular attendee he's asking, he says that my boss says that his company does not have a collective agreement with any union. Am I still entitled to retrenchment benefits as a PMET?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Actually, there's a long answer to that question. As alluded to earlier, let's start with a unionized company. In a unionized company, in most cases, there will be a collective agreement. And the collective agreement is actually an award of court. The Industrial Arbitration Court actually awards, and it's a publicly available document. It's gazetted. It's called collective agreement, usually lasting between 2 to 3 years. And this, in most collective agreements, there's usually a quantum or some provision for the payment of retrenchment benefits. Yeah. So if there's a quantum there, it's perhaps, example, it says 1 month per year of service. Parties, especially employers, need to comply with that. So that's one. If it's not, unclear, or for example, it says maybe the payment of retrenchment benefits, the amount can be negotiated, then reference will be made to the tripartite guidelines and advisories. And in the tripartite advisory, if you have read the fine print and managed to get past the first few pages, it does say that in unionized companies, it's usually 1 month compensation per year of service. Yeah, so that's important to note in a unionized environment. In a non-unionized environment, that's what Francis shared very in detail earlier. You still have to rely on tripartite advisories and guidelines and industry practice. Why do I say that? I actually have had a few experiences personally, because actually it was a case where we had a group of PMETs, PMETs exactly on point as what one of the listeners or viewers asked. This particular company, with one of our unions, it was actually a group of PMETs, junior PMETs. They were not rank and file, so therefore they were union members, and it was a unionized company, but they were PMETs. So actually, in that case, I actually escalated the case to the Industrial Arbitration Court because it was a deadlock at Ministry of Manpower. And you are asking, how come the union can represent PMETs? But the Act, in the Industrial Relations Act, does have a Section 30A, which actually allows limited representation in certain areas, which includes payment, retrenchment payments as part of the areas where we can actually, in a limited way, represent professionals, managers, executives, and technicians. So in that case, I actually brought the case up. There were actually 30. I remember very vividly. It was a couple of years back, but it was 35 of them, all PMETs, executives, and because of the act, you had to file 35 affidavits, and we were like hauling the whole tons of documents to IAC, because IAC is in the Supreme Court, is right up there, Court 9, but lo and behold, because basically the pleadings were all the same, so we actually combined all the 35 cases and we heard it, and Justice Chan Sing Ong actually heard it throughout. And in that case, very, very important, because in that case, he actually makes a few pronouncements, judgments available on LawNet, that payment of retrenchment benefits, you need to consider a few things. Firstly, tripartite guidelines and advisories are important. What is stated in the collective agreement is important. And what is industry practice is important. And finally, one very important point, which I still remember very vividly, company must have an ability to pay retrenchment benefits, because it may be a situation where the company is at the brink of liquidation, and even if you decide to force the company to pay retrenchment benefits, it may end up having the company to wind up, or to go into bigger debt. And therefore, I think the principle is to make sure companies stay as a going concern. So these are some of the guiding principles I thought useful to share. And maybe just to double click on the point whether PMETs, there's no restriction for PMETs to join as union members. In fact, that's the journey that myself and my colleagues in the labor movement have been trying to, outreach, evangelize, and preach. Literally, particularly during this period, because actually, if you look at prior to COVID-19, the most vulnerable workers are actually the PMETs, including the mid-career ones. And now you get a double whammy situation where you have COVID-19 plus the fact that historically these are more vulnerable workers. So therefore, the need for this group to be as union members, and we have actually changed the law, the Industrial Relations Act, a number of years back. I also again remember it vividly because I was the culprit that lobbied for it, and in fact, it now allows rank and file unions, in fact all unions, to be able to collectively represent PMETs. But there's always this air of uncertainty in the corporate world that says, no, you better don't be a union member. You're an executive, so you're never represented. It's not true. It's not true. I think perhaps if you are the CEO or the HR director, maybe not, because there'll be a conflict interest with industrial relations. But otherwise, most workers in the company should be able to be members. The issue now is whether they can be collectively represented, or in a limited way, or not at all. Yeah.
Patrick, maybe then to follow on this point, you've said that if you're a member of a union, then obviously it the sense that I'm getting is that it makes it somewhat easier, perhaps, when you have like how you phrased it, I think earlier, when you said there's when you have unity, right? It's easier, perhaps, in terms of bargaining position. Then maybe to go back on the question that was asked, what if, let's just say, the person is not a member of a union right now, and it's a bit too late to then join a union. Perhaps I'm facing the problem right now. My boss refuses to pay retrenchment benefits just because of the status that I have right now, where I'm a PMET. Are PMETs or non-union members then, are they also entitled to retrenchment benefits?
Yes.
What does the tripartite advisory say for this?
Yeah, the tripartite advisory does not discriminate between whether you are PMET or non-PMET. It's applicable to all workers, regardless of gender, age, nationality, whatsoever. However, for those who are not members, that's why we created the Tripartite Alliance for Dispute Management, TADAM for short. And lo and behold, again, after lots of lobbying, they have lifted they lifted the gate and the markers, and now the Employment Act is actually applicable, not just to PMETs but to all PMETs. Yeah, regardless, there's no more a salary threshold and ceiling. So that's good news for everyone. We just managed to get it changed not too long ago, but I said now TADAM hears all cases. So so ECT actually now only has the only what I say limitation will be the amount of claims that you can file. I mean, the jurisdiction is limited by the quantum, the quantum. But other than that, any worker, you can be the high-end executive or even a rank and file worker. Everyone, you can have access to TADM as well as the ECT.
Thank you, Patrick. Maybe I think this is a good point for us maybe to go into the next topic of assistance for affected workers or retrenched workers. Patrick, let's can you give us maybe a brief rundown of the different assistance methods that people have available? I know, for example, if you're a retrenched local worker and you meet the eligibility criteria, you can apply for the COVID-19 support grant from the Singapore government. But I think the issue really is that even if you get paid retrenchment benefits, you have the support grant. The fact is the money is not going to last for long, right? So obviously everyone is interested in going back to work, where you have a steady stream of income regularly coming back in. Can you tell us about the different ways, perhaps, that retrenchment benefits, retrenchment assistance from the government, and training, upskilling, how they kind of fit together?
Yep. Thanks for that question. I think we have a plethora of schemes and help measures, as well as a wide spectrum as well. But I think more importantly, if you look at the raison d'etre of retrenchment benefits, it's actually to help the worker tide through the period while he's looking for another job. So that's the raison d'etre of a retrenchment benefit. I think the key is to help him tide through, and of course, to lend him or herself a job as soon as possible. So that's a bit about the rationale of retrenchment benefits. But I think what we are doing is now multifold. In the unfortunate eventuality that a worker is retrenched, there are few things and few support measures that you can take. Of course, you just alluded to some of the national schemes specific and particular to COVID-19. The COVID-19 support grant, which is available in the community and online. And now, in an unprecedented way, it has been extended as well to the self-employed and freelancers through the self-employed income relief scheme. So these are two concurrent schemes that are helping, and both you can use the online eligibility checkers as well as do online applications for both, and they are still in progress. So these are two measures at a social level to support fellow Singaporeans and workers who are affected either by retrenchment or a massive pay cut, or but of course subject to some criteria that's been set out within those two schemes. But over and above that, actually two very important interventions, what I call employment and employability. So in terms of employability, yes, if you hear stories and updates that there are so many jobs here, there are so many jobs there, then people will be quite frustrated. Where are they? And what do they do? What do they want of me? And therefore, that's why there's a whole series of skills upgrading and training programs and support. In fact, I think locally in Singapore, we besides employer support, there's also individual initiated training that's supported. For example, through the Skills Future credits, which is now further enhanced this year. From $500 5 years ago, you get another $500, and if you are between 40 to 60, you get another $500, and if you are an NTUC member, you get another $250. And And the list goes on. Yeah. And these are some of the support schemes to help to enhance your employability so that you can equip yourself with some of the skills. Even if it's riding through a short period of time while you're looking for a job, I think training actually helps to keep you in tune, engaged with the labor market and with the workforce and with the industry. So very, very important. I can't emphasize more. Some people will say, I go for training, but at the end of the day, do I get a job? I mean, even if it doesn't land you a job, it does change your perspectives. It keeps you connected with people and a community of people. And of course, pick up skills. I mean, most of the supported courses are relevant skills. They won't support you for programs which may not have outcomes. But however, we hope for the best, that you get a perfect match. And finally, of course, the employment assistance. Employability is one thing, but also employment. I think particularly during this period, I'm very concerned because there are a lot of fears and anxieties in the last couple of months and the months moving ahead. I think there will be even more fears and anxieties. I really hope many of our workers, if they, in whatever capacity, maybe they have been notified that they may be affected or they're going to be affected, or companies know that they're going to effect some of these plans, to touch base with us, the labor movement, through our Employment Employability Institute or through Workforce Singapore, two major agencies that are helping companies at no cost. I repeat again, it's free of charge, at no cost, to support companies, workers in that journey, partnering them either through deploying employability coaches and also fleshing out the whole plethora of available openings. It may not be a full-time job, but it could be a temporary job like safe distance ambassadors or swabbers, or even to go for a prolonged period of training to equip themselves, like some of our professional conversion programs, where they can undergo some training to pick up some skills, like, for example, digital marketing or some cyber security skills. If they have some adjacent skills already, you allow them to easily pick up these new skills so that they can segue to some of the openings which we have identified. And it's recent as the recent budget, the SG United Traineeships program. We know many companies, I know personally because I'm in contact with many of them, multinationals, huge organizations. Because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a general freeze of headcount in many big companies. Yeah, so what they have done is these host companies have volunteered themselves. Say, I'm preparing for the after maybe 1 or 2 years time. I don't mind taking trainees, but I can't take employees because of a global freeze in headcount. So we have come up with this SG United Traineeship program. It's in progress now. I'm glad to share that quite a number of companies have come on board, but the details will be out soon, so please be patient. I know my colleagues at Workforce Singapore, E2I, are working their guts out to get the program out as soon as maybe, so that many of our workers, mid-career workers, as well as those who have freshly graduated, i.e. from the ITE, poly, or university, to support them in that journey. So don't lose heart, don't be disheartened. I think there are these various schemes and support measures that we have already augmented, fortified, and to help you walk that journey.
Patrick, I want to follow on this point, from the NTUC's perspective. So the other day, I was just, surfing the net as usual, and I came across, this reference to NTUC's Learning Hub, and also another scheme from NTUC, the NTUC's Job Security Council. Can you just give us a very brief overview of what these two schemes are about?
Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Sarita. In my earlier sharing, I went. I gave all out and I forgot about these two important institutions. Actually, the Job Security Council, actually we rolled it out late last year and officially launched in sometime in February this year. It's actually a concept which is if you do Google it, I think Sweden has this concept of a Job Security Council, where the main objective is to try to place workers and segue them into another job even before they leave the current jobs, especially when they're affected in such cases. For example, if XYZ company wants to lay off people, but we know ABC company is actually wanting people and hiring people because they are expanding certain functions, and therefore E2I through this Job Security Council will touch base with XYZ company and say, since you're letting go X number of people, why don't I know ABC company that's hiring people. Can we kind of like do a segue nicely for them so that when they leave this company, they can immediately assume positions or even traineeships in the ABC company? So that's what the Job Security Council is about. And we are leveraging our labor movement network. We have more than 1,200 unionized companies, and we are leveraging on this network as well as the public sector as well. If you have noticed, the public sector has also stepped up hiring and brought forward a lot of the hiring, and therefore we are working very closely to segue people, sort of like a preemptive approach to minimize the ramifications of a layoff. And in respect to NTUC Learning Hub, it's actually the training arm of the labor movement. I think, as I alluded to earlier, we try to get people actively engaged in the industry and actively engaged in the labor market. Although they may not be employed, but actually by undergoing training, they meet with like-minded people, and they will have a chance to interact with people in the industry who are conducting some of these programs. And therefore, in the meantime, in the job search, while they get actively engaged through training from NTUC Learning Hub, which has both blended learning as well as online learning as well, for those who for some reason, for example, like the circuit breaker period. So there are quite a number of people who undergo online learning and blended learning as well, so they have to prepare them for the next job.
Thank you, gentlemen. Maybe let's move on to the last slide. I can see actually there's a lot of questions coming in. So I do want to get to the Q&A section as soon as we can as well. On disputes then, Francis, can you run us the different avenues? What if there's a dispute? We've discussed about this thing about reducing manpower costs, payment of retrenchment benefits, termination of employment by notice. Obviously there will be there will be disputes that will arise. Especially when it comes to retrenchment. What if a retrenched employee does not agree that the employer's business is being severely affected during this period? Or what if he doesn't agree, on the amount of retrenchment benefits that he's going to get, as agreed with the employer or under his contract? Is there somewhere that he can go to file a complaint? I think Patrick did mention about TADEM. You yourself as well, you mentioned MOM. Can you just run us some of the schemes of the different ways that maybe we can reach resolution on these disputes?
Okay, thanks for this. I'm going to take a rather unconventional approach to this topic of disputes. Okay, and I would break it down into perhaps these 3 or 4 aspects. The first is I know from my practice experience that Singapore's approach to this whole upheaval in its employment and the unemployment scene caused by the COVID situation is the envy of many other jurisdictions. Other jurisdictions are also having their help and support measures, but they do say that the way that Singapore is approaching it is holistic, it's systematic, and it's targeted. So as I was sitting here listening to Patrick earlier, I think if I could summarize it, a key message to all of the listeners out there is that you're in a situation now, you may feel all alone, but reach out, because there are these help schemes that are available, and all you need to do is just ask, avail yourself of them. I know that in many of the people that I work with, when they come to me inquiring about a dispute, their concerns are, do I qualify? Do I meet this criteria? And a lot of it is, their own fear and their unawareness that's holding them back. And so what you really need is to actually go forth, all right, and see what is available out there, because a lot of help, a lot of effort, as Patrick says, his teams are working their guts out, a lot of effort is being put in there. You just need to avail yourself of these measures. That's the first big idea. The second then is in terms of disputes. Let's take a preemptive approach to it. Now, employers, that there is the legislation there's the overlay of the tripartite advisories. There is this balance, as we've heard about how the law talks about the company's ability to pay, the survivability, but there's also then the need to be fair towards the employees. So employers, whatever plans and measures you are going to take, do run a check with the tripartite advisories and see, benchmark your actions against what is found in there. And if you have doubt, call up the various helplines or hotlines and make the necessary inquiries. This will prevent you from having taken a step and then realize later that you somehow fallen short of a standard, or that you've kind of like offended your employees, and then you're going to then be faced with a claim. On the employee side, uh, you need to be proactive. Very often, when companies are in crisis, everyone goes into their own individual lockdown. Communication goes out the window. Everyone is talking in the little groups as to what's happening. Everyone's whispering. Fear and uncertainty abounds. You need to be a little bit proactive. If you are concerned that your job may be in jeopardy, speak to your HR. Ask them, what are plans or avenues available in the company for you to upgrade yourself. All right. Just opening these kind of communications will actually cut through all of the doubt and the uncertainty, and it will actually help you to have that meaningful dialogue. Now, if after having done all of these disputes arise, I think your first port of call is to go to the TADM. All right. Uh, it's not exactly what we call adversarial hearings. It is more of a mediation, of a conciliation, trying to help parties communicate, understand each other's position, and reach a landing. Only when TADM fails, then the matter may be escalated, perhaps to the ECT. All right. Yes, there are the what do you call that, quantum limitations, as Patrick mentioned. So we do see the odd cases that actually end up in a high court dispute, for example, where it goes into a full-blown contractual dispute. But even in cases like that, the court systems are now geared such that they would encourage parties to, at all stages of the proceedings, be open to mediation. And from my experience, a lot of these cases, you may have a writ filed in haste and in anger. And then as the case goes on, cooler heads prevail, and the matters are usually resolved. And Patrick and I were talking about this earlier. Very often, the ingredients that were missing in the beginning were communication, and clear understanding of each other's positions. And a lot of this could be avoided if parties only made the effort to communicate clearly. And I think a lot of that would avoid disputes, or at least help from the employer's perspective manage the disputes, because your employee then feels that they have been fairly treated. And that goes a long, long way in managing the difficult time that we have now.
Thank you, Francis. Patrick, on this point, I have an interesting question from one of our audience members. I know, like what Francis was just talking about, we've raised the issue of communication throughout this whole webinar, right? The importance of having the right communication between employees and workers. This audience member is asking, the issue of communication has been raised multiple times during this webinar. However, it fails to recognize and acknowledge that there is a power dynamic between the employer and the employee, which is very true, which can be exacerbated in times of economic uncertainty. Employees may not have the power to question the employer's decision. While TADM is in place for an employee to report any such behavior and seek advice, the way TADM works is to contact the employer, which may leave the employee in a situation that is vulnerable and perhaps open to retaliation. especially if they're still employed. What can be done to better protect employees when facing this kind of unequal power dynamic?
Coming from the labor movement, I can just say one thing: unity is strength. There's no way you can level up standing alone, working in silos, and trying to hit at because you definitely is the more vulnerable person. Yeah, you don't have deep pockets, and therefore actually you don't have very strong collective bargaining ability. So I can't emphasize more. Be a union member, form a union within the company. That's why we have been advocating this, because with union environment, you kind of level up and reduce this gap between the ability to collectively bargain and to level up the relative strengths between employees and employers. So I think that's one of the ways that we can actually level up, and so that you don't have to be at the weaker end of the bargaining chip.
Thank you, Patrick. Maybe let's move on. There's a lot of questions that I want to ask, and some of them I'm actually personally curious about as well. So thank you both for the informative session that we've had so far. Okay, so let's move on to our first question. This question is on unemployment insurance. This member, and something I'm also curious about, because it goes back to public policy as well. When we have a COVID situation like this, unprecedented, very challenging, still ongoing, is the government looking at something like unemployment insurance for this moment?
Yeah, if I may just chime in on this, since it's kind of a topic which I've spoken publicly about, and also shared my thoughts about it. Yeah, I mean, it's something we really need to study it carefully. So what's happening now is that government is trying to encourage people. It's called in the many parts of the world, it's called active labor market policies, meaning we try to get you actively engaged in the labor market where possible, because having a job is the best security. Yeah, having a job is the best security, so as to maintain your life and your livelihood. So through the workfare scheme, either through training and through the whole plethora of things I shared earlier, is to help you to segue into a job as quickly as possible to minimize the pains of unemployment and retrenchment. So that's the way to go. But personally, I've commented on this several times publicly about unemployment insurance. I think we need to take a very closer look at it before we roll it out. Because yes, it may look viable, but there are certain considerations, because if it operates very much like an insurance premium. I mean, but the people who will sign up for this unemployment insurance are more likely those who are more vulnerable. So if you remember, insurance, how it operates is a pool concept. Yeah, everyone goes in the pot, the kitty, so to speak. So those people who think they are less vulnerable to unemployment, it could be certain sectors or certain parts of the economy, will not subscribe to this, because they know they are very, very not so vulnerable to the unemployment. However, if you notice, you'll be those who are in highly volatile industries and highly likely to face a situation of unemployment that will subscribe to it. So you have a kind of like a imperfect situation where it'll be a bit lopsided. And again, I can't emphasize more. Actually, today as we are talking, there are actually available in the private sector unemployment insurance that are available. I think globally, I've seen a few. Some are on fintech platforms as well. I'm quite familiar with some of them. I think if you do a search on Google, there are some available globally and online. But again, I also noticed that what then is the desired payout? So earlier I talked about premiums, how much to give as a premium, and then how much do we charge as a premium? Second is, how much do you think do you value it's a acceptable wage to be able to tie a worker until he finds the next job? So these are questions which need to be answered, because it depends on your lifestyle, your financial circumstances, your obligations, as well as a whole host of other things. And it's going to vary family from family, person to person, and whether you are in different hierarchy, it's going to be different needs and different circumstances. So it's not so straightforward. It's something worth looking at, as I've shared before. But I don't think we are getting there, because it may impose unnecessary obligations and burdens on different groups of people and distorting some of this. But for those who are really keen on having unemployment insurance, I know some of the online platforms, they do avail this. But I took a look at it, and frankly, the amount of payouts every month, if you get unemployment, are not that great. I think some of the support schemes that are available through Workfare actually pays slightly better than what's available out there.
Thank you, Patrick. I have two questions here for Francis, as the practicing lawyer on this webinar. The first question, Francis, is can an employee, this is moving back to the termination by notice point that you mentioned, where the employer doesn't have to give a reason for the termination. So can an employee demand the employer to give the reason why the employee was contractually terminated?
I think based on your contract terms, the answer is that the employer doesn't owe you an explanation if he has exercised the contractual right of termination. But having said that, I think my experience is that a lot of the employers now have enlightened HR policies. So before they even exercise that contractual right of termination, you would have been able to see the handwriting on the wall, either through performance reviews or feedback given to you. And then the onus is on you as an employee to see how you are going to react. Typically, I've seen both sides of the coin. Employees that are seeing these handwriting that's appearing on the wall, they go into defense mode, and they pretend that it didn't exist, that it's not there, and they just hope that their job stays. That's not really helping yourself. You may want to actually look about how you can upgrade yourself, upskill, remain relevant to the organization, or otherwise, if you see the handwriting on the wall, then you should be actively looking for a job as well, because don't forget that clause cuts both ways. You can give the contractual notice to the employer and say, bye, I'm leaving you in 1 month's time, and I don't have to give you an excuse. But of course, that is in normal times. We are now in COVID times, and you may not have a job out there, or jobs are not so freely available. And that is why our earlier context of discussion was, what's the best practices? How can we all work together to see how to reach a softer landing through these difficult times?
Sure. Thank you, Francis. The next question for you then is, in cases where an employee has agreed to a reduction in salary for the past 2 months due to COVID-19, how does this affect the employee's entitlement to pay in lieu of notice in the case of a termination? Will this amount also be reduced because of the pay reduction?
Okay, the jury is still out there. All right, I've had employers come and ask me, if I reduce this person's salary for the next 3 months, and then when I eventually let the person go, I pay a lesser amount, correct? All right, now on one argument, that might seem be the black letter of the law, okay? But if you really think about it, if you have planned to reduce this person's salary and eventually let the person go, we fall squarely within those tripartite advisory guidelines that basically say, is this a way that you're dealing with excess manpower? And have you then dealt fairly with the situation? So I would say that, if an employee finds themselves in that situation, ask the difficult question. Put the employer to task to, face the scrutiny of MOM, as to what their actions were. And if the company had acted responsibly, then the company has nothing to fear, and the employee would have felt vindicated. The earlier part about the difference in power, the fact is that employees, if you really are feeling so aggrieved, you do have avenues to go to. You don't have to be silent sufferers, as it were. All right. And so, again, the message to the employers out there is, if you're planning such things, get legal advice, but check also against the tripartite advisory as to what the best practices are.
Patrick, I think on this note, I want to go on to you, especially because you're so active in the labor movement and always advocating in Parliament on our behalf. This is a question also relating to termination of employment. So it's a question on, basically, if an employee has been, the employee's job has been terminated already, then, there's not really much recourse that they have, when it comes to trying to balance maybe the power dynamic here, right? They have recourse options like TADEM, MOM to go to, and obviously, the guidelines are there to help out the situations. But the fact is, the employee, if they've lost their jobs, they don't have a source of income anymore. So to go to to resort to mechanisms where you have to pay a certain fee, I think it's really felt in the pocket, right? Because it's money that can be spent putting food on the table, literally. In this case, then have you heard anything on the ground, or are you advocating in terms of maybe passing actually solid legal legislation, to protect employees from being unfairly terminated in the first place, so that they don't have to go through the time and costly affair of going through TADEM and then ECT and then further on?
Yeah. So if I may share, actually TADEM and ECT does not charge you an exorbitant amount. Yeah, it's actually basically some very small amount of administrative fees. It's not like you enter into a civil suit where there's a lot of filing fees, etc. Where there's a lot of documents and potentially protracted kind of situation. So actually, it's the main intention for the formation of the ECT and TADM was to provide an economical, accessible form of assistance. However, just to add on, in fact, we just last year opened up the floodgate, so to speak, for TADAM and ECT to hear wrongful dismissal claims. So it's early times, but definitely this is something that I'm watching very, very closely, as I have been in the past many years. I think there are a few areas I thought we could take a very much closer look in the future reviews of possibly the Employment Act as well as the Industrial Relations Act. I think some areas like retention benefits, areas as alluded to earlier on contractual termination. In fact, I brought this up earlier this month as well during Parliament sitting to Minister to kind of send a warning order that perhaps maybe employers should give reasons when they carry out contractual terminations, and that's second. And of course, thirdly, like I said, we just opened up and amended legislation to avail affected employees to TADM and ECT, but we'll see how it goes. Like I said, because of COVID-19, more and more of these cases, but I think essentially the other avenues you have is, of course, tap on our Law Society Pro Bono Services Office. We have a partnership under LawWorks with Labour Movement to advise you legally whether it's worth the while to really take on the action, because unfortunately, unlike traditional normal contract claims, in an employment contract, the kind of remedies that you get and the kind of payouts that you get are a bit different from your traditional contractual claims, because they'll look at what's available in the legislation, in the Employment Act, what's provided there, what's provided in the employment contract, to see actually give you a quick proxy on how much actually you're entitled in terms of damages, and whether you want to be reinstated in the previous job where you already have a very acrimonious relationship because the company has already fired you or have retrenched you. So I think you need to look at remedies in a holistic way and in totality before you embark and take the next step. Yes, unfortunately, perhaps that's the way the employment law is across the globe. Yeah, but because a limited number of remedies. Besides damages, there's always only reinstatement. So these are some of the things which complainants as well as those who are affected will have to bear in mind. So get some advice, leverage on all our various partnerships and a lot of the pro bono services to get some form of basic advice to help you navigate better and to help you decide your next course of action.
Let me jump in here. I know that for those who have lost their jobs or who are facing difficult times now, the immediate thing is how to put food on the table. But I just like us to take a step back, since we're in this discussion, to think of it from a slightly different angle. A lot of the discussion these days is how can we make employment more secure? But if you look at the way our legislation was structured, it is intended to be nimble. And if you're talking about a nimble workforce, then there is, I think, a lot to be said of how, as employees, and I include myself in this because over the 30 years of practice, I had to ask myself these questions. How do you stay relevant to your organization? How do you stay employable? How can you make sure your skills are upgraded so that they are current? And if you think of it that way, and you take proactive steps, you know, I think when crunch time comes, you are going to be one of the employees that is right at the head of the queue that I want to keep. And as an employer, I'm going to be scratching my head. How can I keep you? Because you're worth keeping. All right. So I just want to leave you with that mindset, because as we navigate these difficult times together and as you plan your life forward, hopefully you carry this with you. And, even as the employers try to make themselves better employers, employees, this is something that I think is so important. You need to make yourself more nimble, more relevant, and you owe it to yourself and your families, to stay relevant.
Thank you, Francis. I think we don't have much time left, so why don't we move on, to the finishing remarks that we have right now. So before we end, please remember, for the audience members, please remember to download the handouts from the handouts pane. And before we leave, let me just summarize, I think, the key message that we've had so far this evening, which both Patrick and Francis have continuously, been emphasizing throughout our discussion, which is that communication is key, right? And communication, not just communication, but regular, open, transparent, and honest communication is key between employers and workers. We're all in this difficult time together, and communication is probably the right way to do this. And then in the spirit of tripartitism, I want to also summarize the three main prongs that I have when dealing with this issue, right? First, as employees or as workers, I think we need to be prepared to make some tough choices when it comes to helping our employers reduce manpower costs, and also being ready to upskill, get trained up, especially in order to adapt to the new fourth industrial revolution that's coming on. And then number two, then, as employers, I think employers need to do our part in being fair, responsible, and progressive when it comes to dealing with employees and employment matters, really. And then finally, I always want to end with the being a bit humane here, going back to the fact that we are human beings after all, right? So I think as human beings, we all need to understand and appreciate that employment law is not really just the dry letter of the law. You're really dealing with human beings, and you're dealing with livelihoods here. And there are a lot of this is something I think really that we have to bear in mind. As we're both sides are dealing with each other, and I think we can see in tonight's discussion, this is a common theme that has been raised multiple times. I think I just want to end off as well with just saying that please seek assistance if you need. Patrick, Francis, everyone has gone through the different schemes available, to try to get some help. On this slide as well, you can see the different kind of resources that you can access in order to get some help. I want to just briefly talk about the Law Society's pro bono services. So the Law Society's pro bono services runs free legal clinics where lawyers give free legal advice to the public on certain matters such as employment law. If you want to reach out and sign up for a community legal clinic, please drop us an email at enquiry@lawprobono.org. The email address is on your screen right now. Okay, so with that, I just want to end off and say that I hope everyone has found our webinar today very useful. Thank you very much, Patrick, Francis, our backstage coordinators from Law Society's Pro Bono Services and NTUC, and all our attendees. Thank you very much for spending your Friday evening with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.